In the heart of the English countryside, buried deep in the quiet fields of Suffolk, hides something that feels entirely out of place. Locals call it the Sleeping Giant, a name spoken with reverence and curiosity. From the narrow roads that wind through farmland, one sees only a wall of thick trees and wrought iron gates too tall for the average visitor to see beyond. Behind them, concealed like a secret that history wanted to forget, stands Elveden Hall. At first glance, it appears to be a traditional English estate, solid, red brick, unremarkable. But this deception is intentional. Inside, the house erupts into a riot of Eastern splendor that seems less designed and more conjured by dream or madness. The moment you cross the threshold, the illusion shatters. White marble glows like ice. Arches rise into the darkened space above, and the architecture explodes into Mughal fantasy. It is as if the Taj Mahal itself has been reborn in the middle of Suffolk, and you cannot help but wonder, who would do this? Who dared to build India inside England? Before we dive into the answer, take a second to join us in exploring stories the world forgot. Subscribe to the channel if you love history wrapped in mystery. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We'd love to know how far this story travels. And if this mansion's secret already has you hooked, hit the share button and let others discover the mystery behind the title. Now, back to Elveden. To answer this, we must rewind the clock, past centuries of empire and exile, to a single boy king. His name was Duleep Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, born into unimaginable power. His childhood came to a cruel end when the British annexed his kingdom, exiled him from his land, and tore him from his mother's arms. They brought him to England and presented him to Queen Victoria as if he were a gift, a symbol of conquest. They stole his throne, his country, even the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and in exchange gave him a title, a pension, and a foreign home. Elveden was part of that cruel exchange. But Duleep Singh did not forget who he was. Though forced to adopt the mannerisms of a British gentleman, beneath the surface he remained a wounded prince, a dreamer crushed beneath the wheels of empire. When he acquired Elveden in 1863, it was just a house, but in the hands of the exiled Maharaja, it became something else, a vessel for memory, for longing, for grief. He commissioned architect John Norton to transform the interiors, to recreate in plaster and wood the palaces of his lost Punjab. The result was surreal. Delicate carvings on every surface, domed ceilings like inverted lotus flowers, and walls that shimmered with detail. But this was no act of vanity. It was therapy. A palace as protest. A sanctuary of dreams built brick by a man trying to stitch together the torn fabric of his identity. Inside these walls, Duleep tried to become whole again, but the past proved too heavy to hold. Though he built beauty, he could never escape the loneliness of betrayal. His life after Elveden unraveled like a Shakespearean tragedy. Disillusioned by the cold politeness of British society, he drifted to Paris, chasing shadows of rebellion and lost royal causes. Estranged from the empire that had adopted and abandoned him, he died poor and forgotten in a foreign land, a ghost of the golden boy he once was. His creation, Elveden Hall, remained behind, half palace, half dream, waiting for someone else to breathe life into its stonework. The grandeur was there, but the soul had gone, and for decades, the house stood still, suspended in time, holding its breath. What Duleep Singh built was more than a mansion. It was an autobiography in architecture. Every arch, every panel spoke of exile, memory, and defiance. To enter Elveden is to step inside the mind of a man who lost everything, yet tried to recreate home using only imagination and wealth. But beauty cannot fill the space left by belonging. The marble shines, the domes soar, but the silence is deafening. It is a silence born of loss, the kind that lingers in empty corridors and unused drawing rooms. Elveden Hall was a question, unanswered and echoing through its gilded halls. Can one ever reclaim what was taken by force? Yet even in ruin, it was a masterpiece, and masterpieces rarely go unnoticed for long. The story could have ended there, with a broken prince and a house too strange for English soil. But fate had other plans. In the twilight of the 19th century, another man stood before Elveden's gates, not a prince, not an exile, but a titan of industry whose vision would turn the Maharaja's dream into something even more surreal. Edward Cecil Guinness did not see a tomb when he first entered the hall. He saw a stage, and in the battle between old blood and new money, this house would become his greatest weapon. Before that transformation began, however, Elveden remained in limbo, a house built for someone who no longer lived, in a style that England did not understand. The Indian motifs that now define the interior were not yet fashionable among the British elite. Orientalism was rising, but it was still largely confined to art and textiles, not full-scale homes. In many ways, Duleep Singh was ahead of his time, too grand for society, too broken for rebellion. His attempt to blend East and West predated the cultural fusion that would later fascinate Europe. But his tragedy was that he lived on the edge of two worlds, belonging to neither. The locals who lived near the estate referred to Elveden with awe and confusion. They could not see past the trees, but they heard whispers. A Maharaja lived there, a real Indian prince. Inside were treasures from the Orient, rare woods, exotic rugs, and strange statues. But these tales sounded more like legend than truth. No one imagined that behind the red brick shell of the manor lay a replica of a lost empire, carved in stone by a lonely man. And yet it was all real. Too real, perhaps, for England to handle. What makes Elveden remarkable is that it was not created out of luxury or power, but out of pain. So many great houses in England were built to impress, to dominate, to secure one's name in the annals of high society. But Duleep Singh built his as a memorial, as an emotional refuge, as an act of resistance against the identity forced upon him. In this, Elveden becomes more than architecture. It becomes a cultural artifact, a monument to empire's human cost. We often speak of colonizers and colonies in terms of conquest and power, but rarely in terms of stolen childhoods and shattered identities. Duleep Singh's life and house remind us that the cost of empire was often paid in silence, in loneliness, in marbled exile. And so Elveden Hall slept. For years, its domes and corridors rested in quiet dignity, waiting. The echoes of its first owner faded, but the walls remembered. They always remember. Then, in 1893, the sound of footsteps returned, not of royalty, but of a different kind of king, the king of stout and strategy, whose ambitions were not born of loss, but of conquest. The sleeping giant was about to awaken, and the dream of a lost prince would be reborn, not in mourning, but in marble and power. When Edward Cecil Guinness first crossed the threshold of Elveden Hall in 1894, he was not a man looking for a home. He was a man seeking a throne. Already one of the wealthiest individuals in the British Isles, he did not need a place to live. What he needed was a symbol, a declaration, a monument to his ascent. And what better monument than this strange hybrid of empire and exile, half forgotten in the Suffolk woods? To most eyes, the Indo-Islamic interiors were a curiosity, perhaps even a misstep in taste. But to Edward Guinness, they represented a challenge, and more importantly, a platform, where the Maharaja had built a sanctuary for the soul. Guinness saw the bones of a stage for empire. Born in 1847, Edward was the great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the man who founded the brewery that would eventually become a global juggernaut. But Edward was more than an heir. He was a strategist. Under his leadership, the Guinness brand transformed from a successful Irish brewery into an empire of black stout and golden profits. In 1886, he pulled off a financial coup that stunned London's stock exchange. He took Guinness public, making it the first brewery to launch an IPO. The response was so overwhelming that police were needed to control the crowds. In a single stroke, Edward became not just rich, but mythically so. £6 million sterling in Victorian currency meant he now stood shoulder to shoulder with dukes and oil barons. But there was still one door closed to him, the door to the English aristocracy. For all his money, Edward Guinness remained, to many in the old guard, a beer baron. The scent of yeast clung to his name, and his wealth, however vast, could not erase the fact that it came from trade, not blood. The British upper class, steeped in feudal titles and inherited estates, looked down on such men, no matter how polished their manners or how full their bank accounts. But Edward was not one to beg for entry. Instead, he would build his own kingdom, brick by brick, hunt by hunt, banquet by banquet, until the aristocracy had no choice but to come to him. Elveden offered the perfect battlefield for this social conquest. Its sprawling lands, especially prized for their game, were the setting of royal sport. Pheasant and partridge hunts were more than pastimes. They were the rituals by which Britain's elite reaffirmed their bonds. It was on these fields, not ballrooms, where alliances were formed and trust was won. Edward bought not just a mansion, but proximity to monarchy. By acquiring Elveden, he gained something far more valuable than beauty. He gained relevance, and he wasted no time. His approach to the estate mirrored his approach to business, precise, bold, and relentless. He acquired thousands of additional acres, expanding the estate to over 17,000 tons, an empire within the empire. Gamekeepers were trained with military efficiency. Scientific methods were introduced to ensure ideal conditions for hunting. Nothing was left to chance. Elveden would not be just another country house. It would be the stage upon which the Guinness name would be transformed from commerce to nobility. But Edward was not alone in this endeavor. The quiet genius behind the social ascent of the Guinness dynasty was his wife, Adelaide Maria Guinness, affectionately called Dodo. Their marriage in 1873 was more than romantic. It was dynastic. Adelaide understood society in a way that Edward did not. She knew that royalty and aristocrats were drawn not only to money or luxury, but to atmosphere, to emotional engagement, to the intangible aura of belonging. Adelaide became the architect of that aura. If Edward built the structure, she filled it with life. Adelaide's charm, intelligence, and social intuition made her a magnetic hostess. She forged relationships with the Prince of Wales and later King George V, turning Elveden into a second home for royals tired of the stiffness of Buckingham Palace. The Maharaja's eccentric interiors became, under her guidance, the backdrop for some of the most carefully orchestrated gatherings in Edwardian Britain. What could have been dismissed as theatrical excess was elevated to exotic refinement. Adelaide didn't erase Duleep Singh's vision. She amplified it, framed it, and turned it into a spectacle the monarchy couldn't resist. But there was a problem. For all its wonder, the existing house wasn't built to receive kings. The architecture, while lavish, was still that of a wounded exile, not a reigning host. There were not enough bedrooms for an entourage, not enough flow in the layout for grand parties, and certainly not enough scale for a monarch who traveled with a court. Edward and Adelaide faced a choice: tear it down and start over, or achieve something audacious, expand the dream. They chose the latter. In 1899, they commissioned William Young, a Scottish architect known for his ability to fuse classical restraint with monumental drama. His task? To integrate the Maharaja's intimate Indian fantasy with the vastness required by royal protocol. The challenge was paradoxical. How to blend Mughal opulence with British formality. How to honor the past while commanding the present. What emerged over the next 4 years was nothing short of astonishing. The new wings of Elveden Hall were built in red brick, mirroring the original facade. From the outside, the house appeared traditionally English, even reserved. But inside, it expanded into an architectural fever dream. Corridors of carved marble, vaulted ceilings, and hidden service hallways designed to make luxury appear effortless. It was a magician's trick of scale and intention, a royal palace in disguise. Elveden had become a house with two faces, stoic and imperial on the outside, dazzling and seductive within. Edward Guinness understood that aristocratic respect could not be purchased directly, but it could be earned through theater, precision, and overwhelming presentation. Every detail of Elveden was tuned to impress. When King George V visited, his suite offered more comfort than Windsor itself. The plumbing was modern, the heat reliable, the beds soft, and the meals legendary. The Guinnesses offered not just accommodation, but an experience, a world carefully curated for the needs and desires of a king. In a way, Edward's transformation of Elveden was the final act in a silent revolution. The old aristocracy had land, titles, and family crests. Edward Guinness had numbers, infrastructure, and vision. With Elveden, he built something the dukes and viscounts could not, a machine of influence wrapped in beauty. The house was no longer simply a home. It was a tool of diplomacy, a stage for power, and above all, a monument to ambition. And yet, like all monuments, it came with a cost. The expansion of Elveden had been so massive, so deliberate, that it no longer functioned as a domestic space. It had become a place where roles were performed rather than lives lived. Edward and Adelaide had built their own Versailles, but Versailles had never made for a warm family home. Elveden's brilliance began to cast shadows. It demanded constant activity, constant attention, and constant performance. It was no longer a house one lived in. It was a house one presented in. Still, for a time, it worked. Edward Guinness, once seen as a brewer with aspirations, was now accepted as a peer of the realm. His parties were attended by kings, his advice sought by politicians, and Adelaide, the soul of the house, presided over it all like a benevolent queen. But as the Edwardian era approached its twilight, and the world edged closer to war, the balance they had created began to tremble. The house that had elevated their name would soon demand something in return. Step through the tall bronze doors of Elveden Hall, and you are no longer in Suffolk. You are somewhere beyond geography, beyond reason. The marble glows like moonlight. Arches rise toward a dome so high it disappears into shadows. Every inch of the space vibrates with the tension between restraint and indulgence, between England and India, between what is seen and what is meant to be felt. This is the Marble Hall, the spiritual and psychological heart of Elveden and of Edward Guinness himself. It is not simply a room, it is a declaration, a palace of triumph encased in the body of a country house. This space is where Guinness's ambition broke free of brick and whispered, "Now you see what I can do." At the time of its construction in the early 1900s, no private residence in England, perhaps in all of Europe, contained such a space. The ceiling soared 80 feet above the floor, rivaling the height of cathedrals. Its design was Mughal at its core. Domes, arches, minarets in miniature, all echoing the grandeur of imperial India. But this was no mere imitation. Guinness demanded authenticity, where Duleep Singh had once used painted plaster to evoke the palaces of Punjab. Edward replaced it with Carrara marble, the same stone used by Michelangelo. Hundreds of tons of it were shipped from Italy, across land and sea, at enormous cost and logistical complexity. But for Edward, the material was not the point. The message was, he was no longer the man behind the Guinness brand. Here, he was something else, a builder of myth, a kingmaker in a world of inherited power. The Marble Hall was built to impress not just royalty, but posterity. Its acoustics were so precise that a whisper in one corner could be heard in another. The carvings were done by over 700 craftsmen, each floral motif and geometric pattern executed by hand. Every inch of the space had been shaped, refined, perfected. There was no chaos here, no spontaneity. This was not a room where people lived. It was a room where they performed, where they entered small and were made smaller by design. To walk into the Marble Hall was to confront the psychology of power. The room was intended to stun, to remind the guest that they were entering a realm where the laws of proportion and practicality no longer applied. It was cathedral, throne room, opera set, and mausoleum all at once. The design did not invite you to relax. It demanded you be impressed. But what set it apart from other great halls of Britain's aristocracy was its style. This was an Eastern fantasy, executed with Western money, meant to express an imperial imagination that had no boundaries. Guinness understood the symbolic language of empire. In his house, the conquered East became aesthetic ornamentation, placed beneath the feet of British kings. But unlike the colonials who parodied foreign styles with half-hearted motifs, Guinness went all the way. The Indian fantasy within Elveden was complete, from the marble balustrades to the onion-domed ceilings. If it was an appropriation, it was one done with terrifying thoroughness. This was the architecture of domination, but also of admiration. A strange hybrid born not of cultural respect, but of cultural desire. Guinness had no intention of going to India. Instead, he brought India to Suffolk, under his control. Outside, the estate continued its work like a machine. There were over 100 bedrooms, guest suites, parlors, and libraries, all furnished with European splendor. Hidden corridors allowed the staff, often numbering over 100 during grand events, to glide through the house like ghosts. Guests never saw the labor. They only experienced the perfection. Fireplaces were lit before anyone entered a room. Wines were aged, menus written in French, and the hunting grounds precisely timed for optimal sport. Elveden was not a home. It was a device, engineered to elevate the Guinness name from the smell of hops to the echo of royal applause. And yet, amid the splendor, a strange emptiness crept in. The very perfection that had once dazzled began to weigh on its creators. The marble hall, though filled with sound during state visits and celebrations, returned to silence the moment guests departed. The echo of footsteps rang out like reminders of absence. For Edward and Adelaide, their creation had worked. Kings came, society bowed, and the Guinness name was secured. But at what cost? The house no longer belonged to them. It belonged to its purpose, and its purpose demanded constant occupation. It was a beast that needed to be fed with parties, with presence, with noise. From the marble hall, guests would move into the drawing rooms, each paneled with expensive woods, lined with tapestries, lit by chandeliers heavy with crystal. Here, the atmosphere changed. Warmth returned. Velvet and leather replaced stone. These were rooms meant to comfort. But even they bore the weight of expectation. Every object in the house had a purpose, either to impress, to suggest lineage, or to echo a lifestyle that few could maintain. There were books that no one read, paintings selected for value more than emotion, furniture chosen not for comfort, but for symbolism. The house was curated, not lived in. It is difficult to overstate just how ahead of its time Elveden was. While other aristocratic homes struggled with aging infrastructure, Guinness invested in modernity. Electric lighting, central heating, flush plumbing, features still rare in the early 20th century, were installed across the estate. Every innovation was made invisible to maintain the illusion of timeless grandeur. This careful layering of modernity beneath antiquity became a metaphor for the family's entire strategy. Blend the future with the past so seamlessly that the distinction disappears. But despite its success, Elveden carried an undercurrent of isolation. Edward had built a palace so effective, so overwhelming, that it became impossible to relax inside it. Adelaide alone had the grace and social finesse to fill the space with genuine joy. She humanized the marble, softened the velvet, and turned the architectural statement into a living home, if only temporarily. It was her presence that gave Elveden its heart, and without her, the illusion would begin to tremble. Still, while the Edwardian age held, so did the dream. The hunts continued, the kings returned, and Elveden stood as proof that empire could be captured, compressed, and displayed like a snow globe on a mantelpiece. But the storm was coming, and in the deep quiet of the marble hall, where the air hung thick with history and ambition, you could almost sense it. The house had reached its zenith. The performance had peaked. The next act would not be one of triumph, but of reckoning. Because what is a palace without people? What happens to a house that requires royalty to feel alive? Edward Guinness had built a monument to influence. But as with all monuments, its purpose faded the moment its audience began to vanish. And when the curtain fell, the applause ended, and silence returned. The marble hall would once again become what it had been for the Maharaja before him, a beautiful prison echoing with footsteps and regret. It is easy to believe that a house like Elveden Hall, so perfectly constructed for influence and spectacle, might defy the passage of time. But even marble weathers, even grandeur can decay when stripped of its purpose. The Edwardian era, which had carried Edward and Adelaide Guinness to the summit of British social life, came to an abrupt end, not with whispers, but with explosions. In August 1914, the First World War began, and everything that Elveden represented, luxury, permanence, imperial confidence, began to crumble like aging plaster behind gilded frames. At first, the war was distant. News arrived through telegrams and hushed drawing-room discussions. But soon, the impact reached the very bones of Elveden. The staff, once a silent army maintaining the estate's perfection, began to vanish. Young gamekeepers, footmen, and grooms traded their uniforms for khaki and were sent to France. The great machines of hospitality, which required dozens of skilled hands to function seamlessly, began to stutter. The house, designed to be full, started to echo. Yet the true blow came not from the trenches, but from within. In 1916, Adelaide Guinness, Dodo, died. Her passing sent a tremor through the vast corridors more profound than any artillery shell. She had been the animating spirit of Elveden, the soft voice that made its scale bearable. Without her, the marble hall felt colder, the velvet stiffer, the parties more hollow. For Edward Guinness, it was not just a personal loss, it was a collapse of meaning. The stage they had built together now lacked its leading lady. The palace built for kings and queens suddenly seemed empty without her laughter echoing in its halls. Edward lived for another 11 years, but those years were not filled with triumph. They were quiet, slow, and increasingly solitary. Servants whispered that the aging earl would wander the halls at night, his footsteps lost in the cavernous silence. The man who once orchestrated royal visits and conquered financial markets now drifted through rooms too large for a single life. The marble hall, once a symbol of power, had become a hollow cathedral of memory. It was not that Edward lacked wealth or prestige. He had both in abundance. What he lacked was purpose, and that is perhaps the most poignant irony of Elveden's story. That a house built to celebrate achievement became, in its final years under Edward, a mausoleum of ambition. He had succeeded in every objective. The Guinness name was permanently etched into the upper echelons of British society. The monarchy had visited. The elite had bowed. But none of that could fill the silence left behind by Adelaide's absence. Like the Maharaja before him, Edward had created a palace to escape his past and reshape his identity. And like the Maharaja, he ended his life not in celebration, but in solitude. When Edward died in 1927, the estate passed to his son, Rupert Guinness, the second Earl of Eva. With him came not just a new generation, but a new philosophy. Rupert was not his father's echo. Where Edward had been an empire builder, Rupert was a reformer, a man of science, agriculture, and politics. He saw Elveden not as a stage, but as a burden laced with opportunity. His wife, Gwendolyn Guinness, would become a member of Parliament, one of the few women of her time to step so boldly into the public sphere. Together, they represented a modernizing force, deeply aware that the world was no longer built for castles and coronets. For Rupert and Gwendolyn, the house presented a moral and financial dilemma. It was a work of art, yes, but also a logistical nightmare. The staff required to maintain the estate in its original state was enormous. And by the 1930s, the idea of employing dozens of live-in servants was already becoming outdated. Taxes were rising. The post-war economy was harsh. The aristocracy, once insulated by land and tradition, now faced real decisions about sustainability. For all its beauty, Elveden was too large to live in and too significant to abandon. They chose compromise. The grand social functions that had once defined the estate gave way to more modest gatherings. The great hunts continued, but they became less about prestige and more about practicality, used as opportunities to maintain the grounds and experiment with sustainable game management. Rupert, forward-thinking in both science and economics, turned his attention to the land. The estate began to evolve into an agricultural enterprise, a working farm that could generate revenue and purpose without sacrificing the land to commercial developers. Yet the house itself resisted this transition. Its architecture was simply too specific. It had been built to receive kings, not raise children or hold committee meetings. The marble hall demanded grand entrances, orchestras, and chandeliers, not quiet evenings and moderation. It was too large to heat easily, too ornate to simplify, too embedded in its identity to be anything other than what it was. It stood like an actor waiting for a role that no longer existed. Then came the second, more devastating war. In 1939, Britain was drawn once again into global conflict, and this time Elveden was not spared. But the estate would not fall into ruin. Instead, it was drafted into service, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. Elveden Hall became the headquarters of the United States Army Air Force's 3rd Air Division. The sleeping giant awoke, but not to the rustle of velvet or the murmur of royalty. It awoke to the rumble of boots and the smell of oil. Imagine the sight. Young American officers in khaki walking beneath Mughal arches, their voices bouncing off Carrara marble meant for emperors. Rooms once designed for kings became planning centers for bombing raids over Germany. Maps covered the walls where portraits had hung. The clink of champagne glasses was replaced by the rattle of typewriters and the low drone of military strategy. The house, built as a testament to imperial leisure, became a command center in the deadliest war the world had ever seen. This collision of past and present created a surreal duality. Elveden was no longer just a symbol of power. It was power in motion. A palace that once staged fantasies of empire now played a real role in the preservation of democracy. And yet, it came at a cost. The wear and tear of war, even from within, changed the house. The illusion cracked. Soldiers slept in the rooms of queens. Boots wore down rugs imported from the East. The dreamscape faded beneath the weight of necessity. When the war ended, the soldiers left. The fields grew quiet again. But nothing returned to how it was. Britain was battered. The class of servants that once sustained places like Elveden had vanished. Inheritance taxes were suffocating. Society no longer had the appetite for such extravagance. Rupert Guinness faced a choice that would confront many families like his in post-war Britain. Attempt to live in a house designed for another age, or walk away. He chose a third path. He closed the doors. The house was sealed, its windows shuttered, its furnishings covered. Elveden was not sold, not torn down, not turned into a hotel or museum. It was preserved like a fossil, frozen in time. The Guinness family moved into more modest residences on the estate, and the great palace stood alone, untouched, like a tomb waiting for an archaeologist. This act of deliberate neglect was paradoxically an act of reverence. Rupert understood that Elveden could not be adapted without destroying it. And so he did the only thing he could do. He let it sleep. Not forever, but long enough for the world to forget. And then, perhaps, rediscover it with fresh eyes. The house, in silence, became a whisper of history. A reminder of how even the greatest ambitions can become burdens, and how sometimes preservation requires absence. After the guns fell silent and the soldiers marched away, Elveden Hall stood still once again. But this was no peaceful sleep. This was hibernation born of necessity, not design. The world outside had moved on, fractured by war, leaner, more practical, and far less enchanted by the rituals of empire and excess. The aristocratic class that once flourished among mansions and marble had been gutted by taxes and irrelevance. And yet, unlike many of its peers, Elveden was not destroyed. It was not sold to developers or converted into a boarding school. It was, in a decision both radical and poetic, left exactly as it was. A stage without actors, curtains drawn, waiting. From the late 1940s through the early 1980s, Elveden Hall became a ghost, not in the sense of being abandoned or crumbling, on the contrary. The estate was maintained with quiet reverence, but no one lived inside its walls. The Guinness family, practical as ever, understood that the house could no longer fulfill its original role. Heating it would cost a fortune. Staffing it would require a fantasy world that no longer existed. Instead, they turned their attention to the land. Under Rupert and his descendants, the estate evolved into Elveden Farms, one of the largest and most innovative agricultural operations in the country. The soil now fed people, even as the marble hall gathered dust. But Elveden's silence only deepened its mystique. Locals began to speak of it in hushed tones. It became a legend, a locked palace where nothing had changed, where time had folded in on itself. Children whispered that the dining tables were still set, that the fireplaces still held ashes from the last ball, that ghostly figures could be seen through the shuttered windows at dusk. The truth was stranger still. Behind those gates, everything was untouched. Furniture remained exactly as it had been. Portraits still hung. Clothing still waited in wardrobes. It was not haunted, but it was haunting. In a post-war Britain that demolished historic homes at an alarming rate, one country house every 5 days by the 1950s, Elveden survived precisely because it was forgotten. The Guinness family had the wealth to keep it closed, and the wisdom not to try to retrofit it into a modern home. They understood that it could not be anything other than what it was: a monument, a time capsule, a frozen echo of ambition and empire. And in that, Elveden became something rarer than a museum. It became a preserved dream. Then, in May of 1984, the doors opened again, not to host a monarch or dignitary, but to the public, curious and wide-eyed. Christie's auction house announced the sale of Elveden's contents. The event became a national sensation. Thousands flocked to Suffolk, creating traffic jams on narrow country lanes. They came not just to bid, but to bear witness, to see what had been hidden for decades behind those trees and gates. And what they found was staggering. Inside, time had truly stopped. Newspapers from the 1930s still lay on tables. Moth-eaten tailcoats hung in closets, retaining the faint imprint of their owners. Books gathered dust in libraries no one had entered in half a century. The marble hall, dimly lit, reflected the faces of visitors like a mirror from another century. It was not just an estate. It was a memory palace, a tomb of taste and ego, untouched by the chaos of the world outside. The sale included over 2,000 lots, paintings, tapestries, silverware, chandeliers, and furnishings. More than $6 million was raised, and with each item that left, a piece of Elveden's soul departed with it. And yet, the house itself remained. Empty now, stripped of its costumes and props, it could have become a ruin. But Elveden was not built to die. Instead, it reinvented itself once more, not as a home, not as a symbol of social aspiration, but as art. And fittingly, it found its afterlife in the most fitting medium: cinema. In the decades that followed, Elveden Hall became one of the most sought-after filming locations in the world. Its bizarre, theatrical interiors, part Indian palace, part British country house, offered directors a canvas no soundstage could replicate. Stanley Kubrick used it for his final film, Eyes Wide Shut, choosing its surreal architecture to convey a secret world of ritual and power. Angelina Jolie ran through its halls as Lara Croft in Tomb Raider. The hit series, The Crown, used Elveden to stand in for colonial Ghana because, ironically, there was no real colonial building in Africa that matched the imperial vision so perfectly as this Anglo-Indian fantasy in rural England. It was a poetic twist. The house that had been built as a stage for royalty now played one in fiction. Where once real kings dined and danced, now actors stood in their place. Where once political power was traded over wine and pheasant, now camera crews and boom mics directed their gaze. The dream of Elveden, to impress, to overwhelm, to exist beyond reason, had finally found its true medium, not reality, but illusion. Yet while the halls appeared on screens, the land outside remained grounded. Under the stewardship of the current generation, the 4th Earl of Iva, Arthur Edward Guinness, Elveden Farms thrives. It is the largest root vegetable producer in the country, supplying supermarkets and feeding millions. The balance is remarkable. Outside, production, agriculture, economics. Inside, silence, spectacle, and preserved grandeur. The estate had become a symbol not of what was lost, but of how things could adapt without betrayal. The house remains closed to the public, visited only by special appointment or film crews. Its roof is intact. The marble still gleams, but it is not lived in. No one calls it home. And perhaps that is fitting. Elveden was never truly meant to be a home. It was always a message, first from a lost prince, then from an industrial king. It was a mirror reflecting the ambitions of empire, the illusions of wealth, the fragility of legacy. In many ways, Elveden Hall is England's answer to Gatsby's mansion. Like Gatsby, Edward Guinness built his dream hoping that if it was grand enough, dazzling enough, the world would embrace him as one of its own. And like Gatsby's, that dream succeeded, but only for a moment. What remains now is the shell, a perfect shell, a breathtaking one, but still, a shell. What does this story leave us with? Perhaps a lesson in ambition, that the things we build to prove ourselves often outlive their purpose, that houses built to contain kings may find themselves haunted by absence, that marble does not rot, but it also does not love. Elveden will stand for centuries more. Perhaps it will remain beautiful. It will appear in films and books. Tourists will whisper about it. But the voices that once filled its chambers are long gone. in the end. Edward Guinness got what he wanted. He is remembered. His name is etched in stone, not just at the brewery, but in the corridors of a house so strange and so magnificent that it cannot be forgotten. But what he left behind was not a home. It was a question about legacy, about purpose, about the price of grandeur. And Elveden Hall, the sleeping giant, remains that question. Silent, magnificent, and still, somehow, waiting.